The seat that was never meant to be. At 35,000 feet. Power isn't just about who's flying the plane, it's about who gets to stay seated. Meet Marcus Ellison, a man who boarded a flight with nothing more than a ticket. A quiet demeanor, and the unshakable weight of knowing exactly how the world saw him. A black man in first class. What should have been an ordinary trip turned into a battle, not just over a seat, but over who gets to belong. When a veteran flight attendant refused to believe he was in the right place, the tension ignited into something much bigger. Whispers turned into stares, orders turned into ultimatums, and just when the conflict reached its boiling point, the plane itself betrayed them. Because power, real power, was never in the hands of those who thought they had it. By the time the flight touched down, it wasn't just a story about turbulence in the air, but turbulence that had always existed beneath the surface. How does a man go from being told he doesn't belong to being the only one who can save them all? Before we dive into this jaw-dropping story, let us know where you're watching from. Hit like, subscribe, and let's get into it. The air inside the Boeing 737 cabin was thick with the quiet rustling of travelers settling into their seats. The low murmur of voices. The occasional snap of an overhead bin being slammed shut. Outside, Los Angeles simmered in the last embers of the setting sun. A city forever moving, forever restless, even in its descent into evening. Marcus Ellison was among the last to board. He had no reason to rush. A man in his early 40s. His face was lined not with age but with knowledge, deep, heavy knowledge, the kind that settled in the bones of black men who had lived long enough in America to understand what silence cost, what anger demanded, and what patience could, on occasion, deliver. Dressed simply gray sweater, well-fitted but unassuming, he carried himself with a quiet dignity, the kind that neither invited nor shunned attention. He handed his ticket to the gate agent, nodded politely, and made his way down the aisle. Seat 2A, first class. He slid into his seat, placed his carry-on beneath the chair in front of him, and exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that wasn't just about travel but about arrival, an arrival into a space where he had earned the right to be, yet knew full well that others might disagree. For a few minutes, the world inside the plane moved as expected. Flight attendants passed through the aisles, checking seat belts and greeting passengers with mechanical smiles. Marcus flipped open a magazine, eyes scanning an article he would never remember because, even in repose, he was always half waiting for the moment when the world would remind him, yet again, that it had not changed as much as people like to pretend. The reminder arrived in the form of a shadow. A woman's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the hum of pre-flight stillness. "Sir, this isn't your seat." Marcus lifted his head slowly, as if emerging from deep waters. Before him stood Margaret Davidson, the lead flight attendant. She was in her mid-50s. The kind of woman whose posture alone spoke of decades in the industry. A career built on efficiency and unshakable authority. Her uniform was crisp, her expression tighter than necessary. She didn't ask for his ticket first. That was telling. Marcus met her gaze. Calm, steady. He had seen this before. Still, he said nothing, just reached into his pocket, unfolded the neatly printed boarding pass, and handed it to her. She snatched it, a little too fast, her eyes flickering over the seat assignment. 2A. There was a pause, the kind of pause where the truth stood bare and awkward between two people, waiting to be acknowledged. She could have left it there, could have nodded, handed the ticket back, and moved on, but some people, some white people, refused to let their assumptions be wrong. Margaret exhaled sharply. There must be a mistake. Marcus blinked. Slow. There it was. That unspoken thing. Older than the plane they were on. Older than the country they were flying over. The idea, no. The certainty that he did not belong here. That first class was not for men like him. Not unless they dribbled basketballs, ran like gazelles, or sang about heartbreak on gold-plated records. He could feel the shift around him. The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, watching from behind wire-rimmed glasses. A woman 2 rows up adjusted her scarf, turning just enough to see without seeming to. The young couple diagonally across from him exchanged a glance, silent, but loud enough. This is what it meant to be black in America. Even in the sky, there were ceilings. Marcus took the ticket back, folded it between his fingers. He leaned back, his posture relaxed in a way that was intentional. In a way that told her, I have done this before. His voice was smooth, effortless. "You should check again." Margaret's face tightened. She hesitated just a second too long. Just long enough for everyone watching to know that whatever happened next was about more than a seat. "I don't need to check again," she snapped. "You need to move to economy." Her voice was sharper now. Defensive. Her authority, her assumption had been challenged. And she didn't like it. And just like that, the quiet hum of the cabin became something else. The businessman lowered his newspaper completely now. The woman in the scarf stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Someone, somewhere, pulled out a phone. Marcus folded his arms. "No, I don't." The words were simple, but they were not small. Margaret's jaw clenched. "I'm not asking." He smiled, not the kind that spread warmth, but the kind that let her know he had already won, even if she didn't know it yet. "Call whoever you need to call," he said. And now, it was a standoff. Margaret hesitated. She knew she should walk away. But people like her never did. Not when they thought they were right. Not when they needed to prove something. She spun on her heel, her heels clicking against the floor as she stormed toward the front of the plane. And then, the whispers began. Evelyn Moore, the young woman with curly hair and bright, watchful eyes, leaned toward Marcus, her voice barely above a breath. "What's her problem?" Marcus smiled, but there was no humor in it. "She doesn't like seeing a black man in first class." Evelyn's lips parted slightly. She glanced down at her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Debating. In the galley, Margaret shoved past a younger flight attendant, Tim, maybe 23, barely old enough to have finished college. He looked at her, wide-eyed. "Maybe his ticket is legit," he said, careful, nervous. Margaret spun on him, her voice low, seething. "Don't start." She pulled out her tablet, her fingers stabbing at the screen. Marcus Carter, 2A. Paid in full. Her stomach twisted, but pride was a terrible thing to swallow. She didn't move right away. She just stared at the screen, as if looking long enough would make it change. In first class. Evelyn glanced back toward the galley, then turned to Marcus, curiosity bright in her eyes. "You don't look worried," she said. Marcus shrugged. "I'm not." Evelyn studied him, then grinned. "She's about to learn something." "Huh?" Marcus picked up his magazine again. "Guess we'll find out." And with that, the plane sat still on the tarmac. Engines humming. Tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus remained still, his hands resting lightly on the closed magazine. The weight of eyes upon him was as tangible as the press of the seat against his back. The entire cabin, no, the entire moment had become something more than a dispute over seating. This was an interrogation. A silent, simmering question hung in the stale air between them all. Inspoken but deafening. "Should he be here?" Evelyn leaned in again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You sure you don't want to get up?" Marcus turned his head toward her. Slow, deliberate, his lips barely moved when he answered. "I'm exactly where I should be." That was the truth, but the truth had never been enough. In the galley, Margaret gripped the tablet so tightly her knuckles paled. She had been wrong. No, she corrected herself. Something else was wrong, something in the system. A glitch, an error, an oversight, not her. She turned abruptly, nearly knocking into Tim, the young flight attendant. He stepped back quickly, sensing something in her he didn't want to disturb. Tim glanced down at the screen she clutched. "It says 2A is his seat," he offered cautiously, like a child afraid of provoking a scolding. Margaret's face darkened. "I don't care what it says." Tim hesitated, shifting from foot to foot. He knew that tone. It was the tone of someone who had already lost, but who would rather set fire to the ground beneath them than admit it. Margaret set the tablet down with a sharp clack against the counter. Her voice was lower now, but the fury in it had not diminished. "He's not staying there." The tension in the first-class cabin thickened with every passing second. Marcus remained still, like a boulder unmoved by the rising tide. Across the aisle, an older white man, Gregory Hughes, adjusted his tie. He had seen men like Marcus before, calm, composed, unshakable. He had also seen how the world responded to them. Greg took a slow sip of his water, his gaze shifting between Marcus and the galley where Margaret had disappeared. He knew where this was going. He had seen it before. The whispering started to spread. Is he really supposed to be in first class? Maybe he snuck in. I heard her say he should be in economy. Evelyn caught the murmurs and sighed, muttering under her breath, "Here we go." She turned back to Marcus. They're choosing sides. Marcus didn't look away from the front of the cabin. His voice was cool, unaffected. They always do. Margaret stepped back into the first-class cabin with purpose. Her spine rigid, her chin lifted. She did not look at Marcus at first. Instead, she turned to Greg, to the woman in the red scarf, to the couple a few seats back. She needed them to see her in control. Then, finally, she turned to Marcus. Sir, I checked again. There is an issue with your ticket. Marcus sighed through his nose. Slow. There was no issue. Not with the ticket, at least. The real issue was standing in front of him, arms folded, unwilling to accept what was written in black and white. Marcus reached for his ticket again, held it up like a preacher holding scripture. What does it say? Margaret's jaw tightened. A flicker of doubt passed over her face just for a second, but it was there. Marcus caught it. So did everyone watching. She could have ended this here. She could have walked away. But she didn't. Instead, her voice rose. Regardless, I need you to move now. Now the heat was turning up. Greg, who had been merely watching before, sighed heavily, shaking his head. This is why flights are always late. Evelyn's phone was out, recording now. She angled it discreetly, but she wasn't hiding what she was doing. The murmurs grew louder. The young man 3 rows back leaned forward, smirking, thumbs tapping away at his phone. Live tweeting history. The moment stretched unbearably. Margaret took a step closer. She had expected resistance, but she had not expected this level of refusal. Marcus did not argue. He did not shout, but he did not move. Margaret clenched her fists, her breath coming faster. She could feel the power slipping from her grasp. The authority she had worn so easily all these years suddenly not enough. She spun on her heel, stomping toward the front of the plane. I'll get the captain. And just like that, the moment changed again. Evelyn whistled low, shaking her head. She's really going all in. Huh? Marcus tilted his head, thoughtful. People like her don't know how to back down, he murmured. Evelyn looked at him closely, then grinned. You do this often? Marcus chuckled. Not on purpose. Greg let out a breath, folding his arms. Captain's not gonna like this. Marcus raised a brow. You think he'll side with her? Greg shrugged. Doesn't matter what the ticket says. Matters what he believes. Margaret burst into the cockpit area, breath short, pulse hammering. The captain looked up from his pre-flight checklist, eyes narrowing. Ryan Hill stood beside him, arms crossed. What's the problem? The captain asked. Margaret gestured sharply toward the cabin. Passenger in 2A refuses to move. Says the system has him there. But I know there's been a mistake. Ryan arched a brow. You know? Margaret folded her arms. He doesn't belong there. Ryan let the silence hang. He let her hear herself. Then, slowly, deliberately, he picked up the tablet from the counter, tapped the screen, and what he saw made his expression darken. Margaret saw it too, and her heart dropped. Ryan exhaled sharply and turned to her. Are you sure you want to push this? Margaret blinked, thrown off. What do you mean? Ryan's voice was low, serious. That's Marcus Ellison. Do you know who he is? Margaret stiffened. No. Ryan gave her a hard, knowing look. Then you've already lost. Back in the cabin, Evelyn leaned closer to Marcus. They're taking too long. That means something. Marcus smirked, shaking his head. It means she's just now realizing she's not the smartest person in the room. A hush fell as Ryan stepped out into the cabin, his face unreadable. Margaret followed behind him, her steps slower, her skin pale. Ryan cleared his throat. Mr. Ellison, he said, his tone even. We apologize for the delay. Your seat is confirmed. There it was. A victory that shouldn't have needed to be won. Margaret swallowed hard, looking anywhere but at Marcus. Ryan turned to her. Margaret, I need a word. Now. The cabin buzzed with quiet, sharp whispers. Evelyn nudged Marcus, her phone still recording. You just made history. Man. Marcus picked up his magazine again. No, he murmured. I just lived it. The tension in the cabin did not dissolve with the words. Words could declare a truth, but they could not erase the doubt that had already settled into the bones of the moment. Ryan Hills had spoken. Your seat is confirmed. Yet Marcus Ellison did not move. He did not lean forward in gratitude. Did not glance at Margaret Davidson to gauge whether she understood the full weight of what had just transpired. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his lap, his fingers barely twitching against the soft fabric of his gray sweater. The cabin was still, but it was not settled. Margaret, standing rigid beside Ryan, swallowed hard. Her face was carefully blank, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, judging, questioning, waiting. She had lost, and yet, even in loss, she was unwilling to accept defeat. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice sharper than it needed to be. "Fine," she muttered, "but he's caused a disruption. This flight has been delayed because of him." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A final attempt, a last grasp at control. Because even when proven wrong, people like Margaret did not admit to being wrong. Instead, they shifted the blame, restructured the narrative. Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose. There it was. The expectation that he should still apologize. That he should shrink himself down into something more palatable, more acceptable. Margaret wasn't conceding. She was recalibrating. If she couldn't remove him, she could make him small. She could let everyone else believe he was the problem. Across the aisle, Greg let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. Evelyn, still recording, whispered, "She's really doing this?" Marcus tilted his head ever so slightly. Considering Margaret, how easily the roles reversed. She, the enforcer of the rules, now scrambling for justification. He, the supposed rule breaker, unmoved, untouched. A different kind of power had shifted, and Margaret could feel it slipping from her grasp. Ryan sighed, rubbing his temple. "Margaret, that's enough." But Margaret wasn't done. She took a step forward, voice louder now, enough for everyone to hear. "You made this into a spectacle, sir." Evelyn's breath caught. The boldness of the statement, the sheer audacity. As if Margaret had not been the one to question his right to be here. As if she had not been the one to raise her voice first. As if it had not been her own need for control that had turned a simple moment into a public trial. But now she was standing in front of everyone, gathering the pieces of her fractured authority. Rewriting the story in real time. Margaret did not need to be correct. She just needed to make enough people believe that she was. Marcus could feel it now, the thick, invisible thing that had always existed between himself and people like her. History. The long, endless shadow of history. How often had this played out before? How many times had men like him been asked to move not just from seats, but from sidewalks, from opportunities, from their own rightful place in the world? How many times had their resistance been twisted into aggression? Their quiet defiance labeled as disruption? A delayed flight, a minor inconvenience, suddenly made more important than the quiet, methodical erasure of dignity that had taken place. Marcus studied Margaret for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "I was sitting." The words were simple, but they were not small. He let them settle into the space between them, into the air still heavy with expectation. "I was sitting," he repeated, his voice even, deliberate. "You were the one who made it something more." A pin could have dropped in that moment, and it would have sounded like an explosion. Margaret's face burned, her nails pressing into her palm. She needed to fire back, to take back control. But before she could speak, before she could take a single breath to form the words, the cabin lights flickered. Not just a brief flicker, but a stutter, a ripple of dimming and brightening that sent a fresh wave of unease through the passengers. A low murmur spread. A woman clutched her armrest. Greg straightened in his seat. The teenager 3 rows back looked up from his phone, muttering, "What the hell?" The intercom remained silent. For the first time, Margaret hesitated. She turned toward Ryan, her lips parting slightly, but no words came. Ryan's face had shifted from exhaustion to something else. A realization, a creeping, sinking understanding that whatever had just happened was not normal. Margaret, desperate to regain control, snapped at Tim, "Find out what that was." But Tim did not move. He was looking at Marcus. Not in accusation, in curiosity. Because Marcus was still calm. Too calm. The flickering lights, the nervous shifting of passengers. The tension that had just taken a turn into something different. And yet, Marcus had not flinched. Evelyn saw it too. She leaned in, whispering, "You knew that was gonna happen, didn't you?" Marcus, for the first time, looked away from Margaret. He glanced at Evelyn, then at Ryan, then, finally, at the window. The clouds outside streaked past too fast. the horizon shifting ever so slightly. Marcus exhaled, long and slow. Then, in a voice barely above a murmur, he said, "You should probably check your systems." And with those words, the energy inside the plane shifted once more. Not just tension, dread. Because suddenly, Margaret wasn't the only one who was unsure of what was real and what wasn't. Ryan's mouth tightened. He turned abruptly and disappeared into the cockpit. Margaret's eyes flicked back to Marcus. Something in her gut twisted. Because suddenly, for the first time, she was starting to wonder. Had she picked a fight with the wrong man? Evelyn, gripping her phone, whispered, "What's really going on here?" Marcus did not answer. Instead, he reached for his watch, checked the time, and waited. The air in the cabin had changed. Moments ago, the fight had been about something simple. A seat, a mistake, a misunderstanding. But now, the lights had flickered, the plane felt different, and Marcus Ellison, the man they had doubted, the man they had tried to move, sat perfectly still. Watching the unraveling begin, Ryan had disappeared into the cockpit. Margaret stood frozen in place, her chest rising and falling in short, uneven breaths. Around her, the passengers shifted in their seats. The tension now more than discomfort, it was suspicion. Evelyn, phone still in hand, leaned closer to Marcus. "What do you mean? Check the systems?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He ran a slow hand over his jaw. Considering. Outside the window, the sky was vast and endless. The world beneath them distant. And yet, here they all were crammed inside this plane, bound by the same fate. Like it or not. In the cockpit, Ryan's hands hovered over the control panel, his eyes flicking between screens. The captain sat stiffly in his seat, his jaw clenched. The system logs weren't normal. The power surge that had caused the flickering wasn't coming from turbulence or weather interference. Something wasn't right. Ryan swallowed. He felt it, deep in his gut, the moment just before something goes terribly wrong. "What's going on?" the captain muttered, flipping a few switches. Ryan shook his head. "Not sure yet, but I think." Then the cockpit door swung open. Margaret stormed in, her face tight. "What the hell is happening out there?" Ryan turned toward her, expression unreadable. "You tell me," he said, "because right now, I'm starting to think the biggest mistake on this flight wasn't C2A. Margaret's breath hitched. She knew. Now, that he knew. Ryan took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "Tell me something, Margaret. When exactly did you decide he didn't belong?" Back in the cabin, the murmurs had turned into whispers. Passengers were checking their phones, exchanging nervous glances, sensing the shift without needing it explained. Evelyn's camera was still rolling. Greg, the older businessman across the aisle, exhaled sharply. "This flight's cursed," he muttered. Or, the teenager 3 rows back chimed in, smirking. "Somebody's about to get real embarrassed." The thing about power is, when it shifts, it never happens all at once. It's gradual, like a crack running through concrete, growing wider with every second until something breaks. Marcus glanced at his watch again. Evelyn saw the movement. "You keep doing that," she said. "Why?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, his voice quieter than before. "Because the real story hasn't started yet." Then, just as the words left his lips, the intercom crackled. A pause, a brief moment of silence. Then the captain's voice, tighter than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor systems issue. Nothing to be alarmed about. We ask that you remain seated as we assess the situation." But the way his voice did not match his words made the tension snap into something thicker, heavier, more real. Evelyn stiffened. "Minor?" she echoed, doubtful. Margaret reappeared in the cabin, her face drained of color. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look at anyone. She just walked too fast to the galley, gripping the counter as if the ground beneath her had just shifted. Because, in a way, it had. Tim, the younger attendant, was already there, glancing nervously between her and the front of the plane. Margaret's hands were shaking. Tim hesitated. "Margaret?" But she cut him off. Voice flat, distant. "Shut up." She wasn't in charge anymore. And she knew it. The plane felt different because it was different. The world she thought she knew, the one where people like Marcus were always in the wrong, was suddenly unstable. She squeezed her eyes shut, tried to breathe. But what if she had picked a fight with the wrong man? In his seat, Marcus finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was low when he spoke to Evelyn. "See," he murmured. "This is what happens when you put cracks in something people thought was solid." Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus exhaled. "The system." Her brow furrowed. "You mean the plane system? Or?" Marcus only smiled. "Both." Greg cleared his throat loudly. Annoyed. "Somebody better start explaining what's going on," he said. But nobody did. Because in that moment, the plane shook. Not hard, just enough to make every heart in that cabin skip a beat. The murmurs turned into open conversation. "What was that? Did we hit something?" Evelyn clutched the armrest between them. "That wasn't turbulence," she whispered. Marcus glanced out the window. Then for the first time his jaw tightened. Because he knew. The story had just begun. The plane shook. Not the casual tremor of turbulence, the kind passengers dismissed with forced smiles and white-knuckled grips on armrests. This was something else. The cabin, once thick with tension, now brimmed with something heavier. Sharper fear. Marcus Ellison felt it before he heard it, a shift in the engines. A hesitation in the steady hum beneath his feet. Subtle, but wrong. Evelyn clutched the seat between them. Her breath quick and shallow. She stopped, swallowed, started again. That wasn't normal. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. Not yet. Across the aisle, Greg muttered a curse under his breath, adjusting his tie like it would somehow stabilize the situation. Passengers knew, even if the pilot hadn't said it. Even if the flight attendants remained composed, they knew. The human body has a way of recognizing danger before the mind fully processes it. It's in the way people shift in their seats. The way silence becomes too still. The way a woman 3 rows back grips her husband's wrist, nails digging into skin. And in that moment, there was no more talk of who deserved to be in first class. No more talk of who belonged where. Because now, nobody wanted to be on this plane at all. In the galley, Margaret gripped the counter so tightly her fingers ached. Tim stood beside her, wide-eyed, waiting for instruction, but she had none. "Margaret?" he tried. She didn't answer. Because in her mind, she was still in Chapter 1, still stuck in the moment when she knew she had been right about Marcus Ellison. When she had control. But control was slipping. And now, so was the plane. The cockpit door swung open sharply. And Ryan stormed out, his face carved from stone. He didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He headed straight for Marcus. The first-class cabin hushed itself before he even spoke. "Mr. Ellison," he said, voice low but urgent, "I need to talk to you. Now." Margaret's stomach dropped. Ryan wasn't questioning Marcus anymore. He was turning to him. And that terrified her in a way she could not name. Marcus did not move right away. He looked up at Ryan, studying him in a way that made time stretch. Greg shifted. Evelyn held her breath. The teenager stopped typing mid-sentence. And then, finally, Marcus exhaled and stood. Ryan didn't speak again, didn't have to. He just gestured toward the front of the plane. And Marcus followed. Evelyn shot up, stumbling over her words. "Wait, what's going on?" But Marcus only glanced back. His voice steady as always. "Stay put." Then he disappeared beyond the curtain. The whispers exploded. Margaret remained frozen, watching the space Marcus had just occupied. Her entire body was trembling. But not from the plane. Inside the cockpit, the air was different. It smelled of heat. Of wires burning where they should not be burning. The captain's hand hovered over the controls. His expression tense. "We've lost partial system control," he muttered, not bothering to look at Ryan or Marcus. "It's not full failure. But we don't know why." Ryan finished. Marcus exhaled, slow and deliberate. His eyes traced the instrument panel. The numbers that should not be fluctuating the way they were fluctuating. Then he spoke. "Your system lagged during takeoff. Didn't it?" The captain's eyes snapped to him. "What?" Ryan inhaled sharply. "Ellison, how did you?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He was looking at the numbers, his mind moving faster than his lips. Because suddenly, the fight over seat 2A felt small. Suddenly, it was about something much bigger. The captain was still staring at him. His voice edged with a mix of frustration and dread. "You knew about this?" Marcus exhaled, ran a hand over his jaw. Then, finally, he said it. "I built this system." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Ryan's body tensed. The captain blinked. Marcus continued, his voice even. "I was part of the engineering team that designed the aircraft's automated diagnostics. And if this system is lagging, he tapped a screen, watching the way the numbers wavered. Then you've got about 20 minutes before it fails completely. The cockpit went silent. Then the plane lurched. Not a dip, a drop. The kind that makes the stomach flip inside itself. The kind that turns passengers into prayers. In first class, Evelyn grabbed the seat in front of her. The woman behind Greg gasped. The businessman muttered, "Oh, hell no," under his breath, his hand gripping the armrest. Margaret stumbled. Her knees almost buckled. Because this wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This wasn't about whether or not he belonged in first class. This was about whether or not they all made it out of this alive. And for the first time, she understood something. The way power truly worked. It wasn't in uniforms or name tags or rank. It was in who people turned to when the ground beneath them stopped feeling steady. And no one was looking at her. No one cared what she thought about Marcus Ellison anymore. They only cared what he knew. Inside the cockpit, the captain made a choice. He stepped back. "Tell me what to do," he said. Not to Ryan. To Marcus. Marcus nodded once, his hands already moving across the controls. Ryan exhaled. "Tell me you can fix this." Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because some men speak with words. And some men speak with action. He reached for the system panel. And the plane kept falling. The plane was falling. Not in the way a rock falls sharp. Absolute. Merciless, but in the way a system unravels. A slow, creeping failure, where each second feels like the last. And the only thing more terrifying than the drop is the helplessness that comes with it. In the cockpit, the captain's breath was shallow. Ryan Hills stood frozen, sweat collecting at his brow. The numbers on the instrument panel were no longer a steady hum of reassurance. They were flickering, stuttering, failing. And in the middle of it all, Marcus Ellison sat in the co-pilot's chair, fingers flying across the controls, his mind moving faster than the plane was falling. No one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew words wouldn't stop the descent. Actions would. In the first-class cabin, the silence had given way to something else: chaos. A woman sobbed into her husband's shoulder. A man gripped the seat in front of him so tightly his knuckles went white. A mother clutched her toddler, whispering something meant to be reassuring but edged with fear. Greg Hughes, the businessman, was praying. The teenager had stopped texting, stopped smirking. He stared straight ahead, as if willing the plane to hold itself together through sheer force of will. And Evelyn was watching the curtain to the cockpit, her mind racing. She turned to Margaret, who was still standing near the galley, pale as death itself. What did he mean? Evelyn demanded. What did Marcus mean when he said he built the system? Margaret had no answer, because her mind was still catching up to a reality she had not been prepared to accept: a world where Marcus Ellison was not just a passenger, not just a black man in first class, but the man who knew more about saving this plane than anyone else on board. Her entire life had been built on certainty about who belonged, about who had the right to authority, about who deserved to be listened to. But certainty was a luxury she no longer had, because the only thing standing between them and the ground was Marcus Ellison. Inside the cockpit, Marcus spoke for the first time in what felt like hours. But when he spoke, it wasn't fear, or hesitation, or doubt. It was command. "The system's not down completely," he said, hands moving over the controls. "It's failing in patches, too many tasks running at once. Overloading the central processor. The autopilot's compromised. But we still have partial manual control." The captain nodded, gripping the throttle. "Tell me what I need to do." Marcus tapped a screen, calculating. "We need to redistribute system power, manually bypass the automated interface. We'll have to route critical functions through secondary circuits. But that means disengaging certain non-essentials." Ryan frowned. "Like what?" Marcus turned to him, calm, sharp, unwavering. "Like cabin lighting, like passenger Wi-Fi. Like anything that doesn't keep us in the air." Ryan swallowed. "Do it." Marcus nodded, fingers pressing a sequence into the panel. The cabin went dark. Screams rang out. Gasps. A chorus of fear. The businessman, Greg, cursed under his breath. The teenager gripped the armrests. Evelyn's breath hitched. She turned to Margaret. "You still think he's the one who didn't belong?" she asked. Margaret didn't answer. She couldn't. Because for the first time in her life, she realized she had been small. That all her years of certainty, All her years of wielding authority, it had been nothing. A fragile illusion she had built to keep herself comfortable in a world that no longer made sense. Marcus was not small. He had never been small. It was only now, in the middle of the sky, with their lives resting in his hands, that she finally saw him clearly. And she was afraid, not of the plane, of what it meant to be wrong. Back in the cockpit, the darkness inside the cabin was mirrored in the shifting glow of failing screens. But the engines held. Marcus checked the altimeter. 10.000 feet in dropping. Ryan's voice was tight. We don't have long. Marcus's jaw clenched. We don't need long. We just need control. His fingers flew across the console, rerouting power, watching as the numbers flickered, some stabilizing, some still struggling. The captain gripped the yoke, steadying the descent as much as possible. Marcus took a breath. Then he pressed one last command. The plane leveled. Not perfectly, not immediately, but enough. The sudden stillness was almost worse than the fall. A heavy, trembling quiet. Then, slowly, the first-class cabin exhaled. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. Greg wiped his forehead. The teenager laughed sharp, nervous, disbelieving. And Margaret finally sat down. She felt small again, but this time, for the right reasons. She had spent her whole life believing she was the one people should listen to. But she had been wrong. And she had almost died for it. In the cockpit, Marcus sat back, his breath steady. The captain turned to him, his expression unreadable. You just saved this plane, he said. Marcus's lips barely curved. Was just sitting in my seat, he murmured. Ryan let out a short laugh, half relief, half something else. And somewhere, in the depths of the aircraft, Margaret Davidson felt the weight of her own silence. Because she had spent this whole flight trying to erase Marcus Ellison. And now, she owed him her life. The plane was no longer falling. But the silence that filled the cabin now was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of realization of people grappling with something they could not name but could feel. The engines hummed steadily beneath them, no longer betraying the eerie lurch that had sent hearts pounding and hands gripping armrests just minutes before. The lights in the cabin remained dim, a quiet reminder that they were not out of danger yet. And yet, all eyes, whether they admitted it or not, were drawn toward seat 2A. Marcus Ellison, the man who had not moved when told to. The man who had been challenged at every turn. The man who had been doubted, dismissed, and nearly removed from his seat. And the man who had saved them all. Evelyn sat back in her seat, eyes still locked on the curtain that separated them from the cockpit. She let out a slow breath, then turned toward Margaret Davidson. Margaret, once the enforcer of order, now looked small, swallowed by her own uniform. Evelyn tilted her head. You're awfully quiet. Margaret blinked. It took her one second too long to realize Evelyn was speaking to her. The woman who had spent years commanding authority, asserting herself, dictating where people should sit, how they should behave, who should belong. Now, she had nothing to say. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. She swallowed, eyes darting across the cabin, searching for something, anything to anchor herself to. But there was nothing, no one to back her up, no excuse that could hold weight, no way out of what she had done. Evelyn leaned in, her voice lower now, sharper. You were ready to throw him off this flight. Margaret flinched. Evelyn tilted her head. Waiting, ain't that right? Margaret didn't answer, couldn't answer. Because what answer could she give? That it had been a mistake? That she had been doing her job? That she had been acting on instinct? But what kind of instinct was that? What instinct told her that a black man in first class didn't belong? What instinct told her he had to be lying? What instinct made her push and push and push long past reason? Long past logic until it nearly killed them all? Greg Hughes, the businessman, exhaled loudly and rubbed a hand over his face. He turned toward Marcus, still watching the curtain as if waiting for the next disaster to unfold. Hey, Greg called, voice rough. Marcus turned, slow. Greg cleared his throat. He was not a man who apologized often. Not a man who admitted when he had been wrong. But this moment demanded something from him. And he knew it. He gestured vaguely toward the front of the plane. That was hell of a thing you did up there. Marcus didn't say anything at first. Then, finally, his lips curved not into a smile, but into something quieter, something knowing. Was just sitting in my seat, he murmured. Greg let out a breath of a laugh. Yeah, I guess you were. Silence stretched between them. Then Greg nodded once. Slow. Appreciate it. And that was all he could give. Marcus nodded back. All right. Margaret felt sick. Because she had watched this happen before. Not this exact moment. Not on a plane. Not with a failing system and a drop that had turned passengers into ghosts of themselves. But the pattern. The black man does something extraordinary. The people who doubted him, the people who had stood in his way, pat him on the back. Say their thanks. And move on. They go back to their lives. And he? He is expected to forget. To pretend that none of it happened. To accept the apology that never comes. Margaret squeezed her hands into fists. Nails pressing into her palms. She had spent this entire flight believing she was right. Even when the system told her otherwise. Even when she had proof in her hands. She had still believed it. And when she had been proven wrong. She had still tried to punish him for it. But now, no one was on her side. No one was defending her. Because in the end, it hadn't just been about Marcus's seat. It had been about the faulty wiring underneath it all. And she had been the one short-circuiting the whole damn thing. The intercom crackled again. Folks, this is your captain speaking. We've stabilized. And we are preparing for an emergency landing at Denver International. Please remain seated. And thank you for your patience. The cabin buzzed with murmurs. Denver. They weren't making it to Los Angeles. Not today. But they were making it. Evelyn exhaled. That's that, she muttered. Marcus glanced at his watch again. An old habit. Then he looked at Margaret. Finally, he really looked at her. She braced herself for it, the anger. The condemnation. The weight of his judgment. But what she saw in his eyes was worse. Because he wasn't angry. He was indifferent. She had spent this entire flight fighting for control. And now, she was nothing to him. Nothing at all. The plane touched down in Denver 30 minutes later. When the wheels hit the tarmac, the entire cabin exhaled as one. Passengers clapped. Some sighed. Some whispered prayers. Margaret sat frozen, hands clenched in her lap. Marcus remained still. He had never needed to move. And now, the world around him was rearranging itself as it always did to catch up. As they taxied to the gate, Evelyn leaned in one last time. You think she's gonna apologize? She murmured. Marcus chuckled, low and tired. She doesn't have the language for it. Evelyn smirked. You gonna let her off easy? Marcus didn't look at Margaret. Didn't need to. She ain't mine to forgive, he said simply. Then, as the seatbelt sign dinged off, he stood. The plane had landed, but the flight was not over. Not in the ways that mattered. The engines hummed in the background. An afterthought now that the ground was beneath them. But inside the cabin, the weight of the past few hours still lingered unspoken. Heavy. Alive in the way people avoided each other's eyes. The seatbelt sign had gone off. Passengers shifted, gathering their bags, desperate for the illusion of normalcy, as if they had not just stared into something deeper. Something more dangerous than turbulence. As if they had not just been wrong. And yet, the truth remained. Some things cannot be undone. Marcus Ellison remained seated. He wasn't in a rush. He never had been. Evelyn was standing now, stuffing her phone into her jacket pocket. But she paused, watching him. You're waiting, she said. Marcus exhaled. Ain't much waiting left to do. Evelyn followed his gaze. Margaret Davidson was still seated near the galley. She hadn't moved, not out of choice, but because she didn't know how to. For the first time in what must have been years, Margaret was at a loss. She had spent so much time believing she had authority, that she was the kind of person who gave orders. Who dictated reality? Who had the final say? But now, she was nothing. And worse, she knew it. Marcus finally stood. He didn't look at her. Didn't offer her so much as a glance. Because she was not important. And that, more than anything else, was what broke her. The aisle was slow moving. Bodies pressed together. People anxious to leave. Greg, the businessman, caught Marcus's eye, gave him a nod. Hope I don't see you on another flight. Greg muttered. Marcus chuckled. Hope I don't see you either. The teenager, 3 rows back, smirked as he passed. Dude, you're a legend, he said, tapping at his phone. This is gonna be everywhere. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because the truth was, this had always been everywhere. People just refused to look at it. As Marcus reached the exit, the flight crew was waiting. Ryan Hill stood stiff, his mouth a tight line. The captain was beside him, arms folded. "Mr. Ellison," Ryan said. Marcus waited. The silence stretched. Finally, Ryan exhaled. "The airline will be reaching out." Marcus smiled. "Just a little. I'm sure they will." The captain cleared his throat. "We owe you a great deal of gratitude." Marcus tilted his head. "No, you don't." Ryan frowned. "Excuse me? You don't owe me gratitude." Marcus said, calm, steady, unshaken. "You owe me a seat. Same as everyone else." Ryan's throat bobbed. He had no answer for that. Marcus didn't expect one. He just stepped past them, out into the bright, artificial light of Denver International Airport, where the world still hadn't changed. Evelyn caught up with him outside the terminal. "You realize they're gonna try to clean this up, right?" she said. Marcus shrugged. "That woman in there," Evelyn continued, stuffing her hands into her jacket. "She's gonna convince herself this wasn't about race. She can convince herself whatever she wants." Marcus replied, "Don't change what happened." Evelyn exhaled. "What happens next?" Marcus checked his watch, then looked up, eyes sharp, clear. "Same thing that's been happening," he said. And Evelyn understood. Because what happened on that plane, it wasn't new. It was just recorded this time. Back inside the aircraft, Margaret still sat in the galley. Ryan had left. The captain had left. Passengers had left. But she remained. Tim, the younger flight attendant, stood near her, hesitant. He cleared his throat. "You okay?" Margaret didn't look up. She was staring at the seat where Marcus had been. And she realized, with a sudden, aching clarity, that she had spent her entire life believing she had the power to move people. But Marcus Ellison had never moved. She was the one left behind. And she didn't know how to live with that. Not yet. Maybe not ever.